Toss you talking, Mr. Adam talking, Mr. Leo
We'll
talking.
all talk for us over, so I'll start.
Well, have it, Bobby.
A couple months back, we brought development manual to y'all, for consideration, and, we, were instructed to bring it back later as we made further progress. As the part that hasn't made progress at this point is mine, we sit as we were before. However, half of this document is done, so we're gonna start. If you wanted to start at the beginning, we'll go through. If you recall the conversation we had last time, this is a manual. It's not necessarily new development or new regulations. There are a few. Anywhere that's new, you'll see a big shiny red new out the side. For the most part, this is a compilation of existing ordinances, policies, so forth. It's designed to be an iterative guide that would take somebody who's never been to Effingham County and allow them to do development here and see our process. It's organized in such a way that it starts, with definitions and terms, goes through the preliminary process, which is, your zonings, all your front end stuff. We'll just see if there's water, sewer, your due diligence type part as far as the property's going. Goes into zoning, sketch plans, and then it begins into the design section of it, the water, sewer, storm, roads, fire reuse, all the different pieces. Then it gets into your project construction portion of the project, all your inspections, tests, stuff that's happened, and then close out all the way through final plan. And it's written in that particular order. So we can just go ahead and jump into this, and without objection, I think we'll skip the definition section. Anybody can read those if you want later on, and jump into chapter 2 preliminaries. This, as you see, is a new section that we've added, which is a pre-development meeting. This is a meeting that occurs between the developer, the engineer, and all applicable staff within the county prior to development ever beginning on the project. The idea for this, and this does happen in other municipalities, and I would say this take off my hat in the past as a design consulting engineer. Me personally, and that's all I can speak for, I happen to like these. It gets everybody out in front, lets everybody know what's expected, saves a lot of time in the design. You know what everybody wants going into it. And if I know what you want, I can give it to you. I can't give it to you if I don't know you want it. It's fairly simple. That was the whole idea of this meeting. It wasn't to put an undue burden on anyone. It was really for information so the developer can hear from staff what's expected. They can ask questions of all applicable staff. You got, water, sewer, storm folks, fire, EMA, EMS, everybody's at the table. And it's just a way to get information out before you spend a lot of time on design plans going down the road you shouldn't be. Just a good.
When was this first?
Misunderstanding.
Yeah. When was the first one adopted?
The first.
Do you know the first? When was this one adopted?
It's not.
It's never
been adopted. This is in
We've never had one adopted.
We've never had. That's
So it's all new.
This is all from. Well, the document is new.
Understand.
What
a lot of the policies, yeah, okay.
New, this, like you were saying, this is a compilation of existing stuff, and the stuff that's marked new is stuff that isn't technically required by current ordinances or policies.
Yeah. In other words, skip forward to 2.2 zoning. If you just start reading it, you see what it says dependency of the Effingham County Code of Ordinances. This is where we start pointing to our ordinances, our code. It's just telling you prior to initiation, you got to have a DRI, you got to do your zoning. This is where zoning regulations are found. These are all the pieces that are involved in it. So the reason these aren't marked new is it's a new document, but it's pointing to existing codes and regulations.
I thought we had this compiled and we were updating it.
No, it has been compiled for the last year and a half or so. It's never made it through to the point of adoption.
This has been sitting on a shelf for basically a year and a half, just waiting for such time as everybody was ready for us to put it forward and move forward on it. But it has never been adopted, and just like you said, section 2.2, there's nothing new in there, although we've never had a section in a manual that says those words. There's nothing new there. I mean, it's just saying what we already do.
Yeah, section 2.3 sketch plans that they're currently required for certain situations, depending on what you're doing. If you're meeting the threshold of a major subdivision under the subdivision regulation, you got to have a sketch plan. So that points out that. And then like 2.4, this gets at the heart of what the manual really was intended to do. If you read it, there's a do you have one, Commissioner Lowe? You want me to print you one real quick?
No, I don't think it is. We got an extra. We got an extra.
You got one? Yeah. Sorry about that.
We're on page 8.
I got one somewhere.
I told, I sent her a text before I
Hey,
shared.
let me
She
think.
didn't have to print some copies.
Page 8 is just when you get there. But 2.4, this gets at kind of what we wanted. This never existed anywhere, and it's just the procedures and activity sequence. Pre-development meeting, zoning sketch plan, water wastewater availability, design package submission and approval, pre-construction conference, submittal and approval record drawings. It's just a chronology of what the process is. And as simple as that is, and tribal knowledge, we all know that, but somebody coming in from the outside world, it just tells them what they need to do, from A to Z. Payments of maintenance, bond, fire play. So,
I just looking at that, I apologize for interrupting, but payment of maintenance bond is something that we really don't do at this point anymore. I probably need to take that out. I apologize. Sorry, go ahead.
but that's basically what the manual was intended to do, is just to give a good synopsis of our existing regulations and so forth. And anything that's listed as new in here is obviously for discussion. If the board doesn't like it, we take it out and move on. If you do, it's things that staff thought could either be clarified in our existing regulations or needed to be added because it needed to be there. There was some ambiguity in it. One example I can think of is lift stations, and it's come up in here as to when is it required to put a generator, when is it required to do this. Well, I don't know that we necessarily are. It says all at some point. Maybe we do, maybe we don't need it. So let's clarify. That will be a new section. Just an example, we'll get it later.
And nothing that's marked new is spectacular or perfect or wonderful. It's just what we came up with. If you guys have input, changes, whatever you'd like it to say, you please let us know.
And again, going to like page 10, there's a lot of new there. These are water, wastewater availability package requests. The basic idea behind this was if on the front end of the project, before any design's ever done, hopefully before the property's purchased, this package is submitted as a formal request from anyone, the developer, the owner, whomever, real estate agent, to the county as to what water and sewer availability is there. And then we will respond back formally that says, this is where things are located. This is where you can and cannot get utilities. This is the infrastructure that's existing. This is what it'll take to get there. And everybody knows up front. It's just a way to avoid ambiguity. And again, if you look at 4.1, what we're asking for is, this is the package, a north area, location, map and scale, parcel boundaries and total acres, proposed street lot arrangement, total number of proposed lot. Is this your proposed layout? It's basically a snapshot out of Sages that you can go on the website with a little bit of description to it. It's not like we're asking you to spend $100,000 on an engineered set of plans to do it. It's just saying, here's the property, this is where it's at. We can go in our system and look at where the water sewer lines are.
If you flip over to page 58, if you want to, there's an actual form that's provided as Appendix A that says, fill out this form and give us that sort of information, and we'll be able to tell you what is available for water and sewer or not.
And what I like about it is everything's in writing, which means then nobody can come back and say, well, he said this, or they said this, and it gets us out of trouble.
But then if water and sewer is not available, it would not be required as a condition of zoning also, right?
In as much as that's the case, you certainly could deal with that through this circumstance as opposed to dealing through zoning, yes, if you wanted to do that.
That wasn't my question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If there is no water and sewer available, like when this form's filled out and the answer is it's not available, then it would not be required as a condition of zoning. It's not available.
In theory, zoning would come before this, most likely in most circumstances you would. Going through the rezoning process may or may not be.
Well, the answer is the same either way.
Yes, I mean, we certainly aren't going to require someone to connect water and sewer if it's unavailable. Absolutely.
And ultimately, I hate to shirk responsibility, but that's not staff's decision. It's ultimately the board is the one that votes and puts the conditions on stuff. It may come in the form of a staff recommendation.
It does not, I don't see it coming in staff recommendation that way any longer, but it used to. So it's welcome.
Correct.
But some of the problems, that's the reason for the things like that happening, that's the reasons this manual could help.
Correct. They would know up front water's located here to get it to you as a 2-foot extension, a 2,000-foot extension.
But also didn't understand that you're saying that the zoning's probably going to come prior to this, so.
Yeah, it is written that way. Now, we can certainly move that in process and have that done concurrently with zoning or
Assuming that zoning is necessary, so that's the thing would be, there may be some circumstances where rezoning isn't necessary.
Get it on the record.
Correct.
I imagine in your pre-development meeting, that will be a topic of discussion.
Yeah,
So an owner,
it should be, absolutely.
that's what I'm gonna wanna know.
Yes, sir.
Whether I desire it or not, that's gonna be a
Correct.
topic.
And ultimately, what it should give us the ability to do is to take a projector in a room, look to our computer system. We have, ARC information. We can look at water lines, we can look at flood zones, we can look at all those things as we speak about the project.
So, no matter.
One of the other things I'll suggest to you is, and I know this isn't part of where we are right now, but in that pre-construction conference, it'd be good to have a list of the contacts, of the county contacts for the developer, contractor, and inspection requirements, and who to contact, when and where. That way in the future, because I've ran into this myself, in the future, we don't have an inspection that wasn't done and we assume was done.
That's going to be taken care of in section 6.1 on page 43. You can add that as well when we get there.
Most of those, would they be at you say pre-construction or pre-design?
I don't know if your inspectors would necessarily, pre-design meeting.
Right. This is-
After pre-construction, they would.
Construction, yes, yes.
That's what I said. In the pre-construction, whenever the,
Oh,
before
sorry,
actually starting
pre-construction.
Yes, he
construction.
said
yeah.
pre-construction.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's why I said
There, get a sign-in sheet, copy of the sign-in sheet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, all that needs to be present and accounted for. And that's one of the things we want to get to. I don't know that we will today, but as we get to the construction section, is to maybe strengthen it a little bit, to have a checklist, and you have to pass A to get to B instead of the way it's been done in the past. And as long as we can accommodate people's schedule, that shouldn't be out of, realm. If somebody calls up for an inspection, we say it'll be 3 weeks from next week, that's a problem. But as long as we can get there within 24 hours of coordinating, it shouldn't be a big issue. And we can ask, one of the biggest things that I've seen since I've been here is problems of storm pipes underneath roadways, sucking dirt and roadway quality. That may be something we need in this checklist. You don't cover it up until we see it. We know there's filter factor. We've checked the joints. We know that those things are in there. We know the boxes are routed properly. And that shouldn't be out of realm of possibility to coordinate something like that. To say, I know I'm going to be crossing the road tomorrow.
That's reasonable, we do that with the driveway culvert.
Yes.
It's reasonable to do it in subject.
Yes. And unfortunately, we haven't fully fleshed out that section yet. We'll get to it further with manual, but, and I don't know, it's up to the board how much detail y'all want to go into here. If you look on page 11, the general design plan requirements, you'll see it starts listing out everything we want in the general plans, and these are general things, scales, north arrows, not specific to water, sewer, storm, just generally in the plans. And this same exact format will show up in water, sewer, reuse, storm, specific to those particular items and functions. So if y'all want to go through them all, we can certainly do them.
There's nothing new in that section. Pretty much all of that is directly out of either the development plan, ordinance, or the subregs. So there really isn't anything out of the ordinary there that isn't already required expressly now.
Some of the, the wastewater availability request form, being it standardized, will there be a standardized response?
Yes.
Okay, so there'll be a standardized, okay.
Yes, and again, page 58.
Just to avoid any ambiguity in the response.
Correct.
All right, within 30 working days of receipt, the county will respond in writing. So yes, it'll be a standard.
So it'll be a standardized.
This is what's going on with water and sewer, and this is where you can connect or where you not connect.
Correct. And it was available, what size, any information we have pressures on, we could give them, generally whatever, just whatever information we have available. We could tell them it's a 16-inch ductile iron main, so they know it's a 2-inch PVC terracotta. We don't have to do that.
Thank you.
But again, I don't want to gloss over something y'all want to drill into the details on. If we continue until you get to page 15 starts water design standards. That's actual water, the infrastructure. The rest is basically, and like on page 14, you'll see other documentation. This is where we get into all the other pieces outside of the plans. Again, it's all required now. It's just nowhere that it's listed. NPDS and NOI forms, we currently require them. We just don't have a list of them. One of the things we did do, the third bullet down here, wetland delineation, jurisdictional determination, annual U.S. Department of Engineer permits related to filling rating, if NWI map indicates possible presence. So that was never there. Effingham.
It wasn't until the Part 5 ordinances were approved back in November of 2012, actually. It wasn't there prior to that. So as of the time this first draft of this manual was written a couple years ago, that was new. But it has been, the word new has been removed for that because you already passed the wetland ordinance back in November of 2012.
Okay. And we just wanted to clarify when a wetlands jurisdictional determination will be required. If you look on the NWIs and it's in the middle of a sand hill, obviously we don't need it. If the NWI say it's near, I'm not capable of making that determination whether it is or not. We need that documentation.
So I've gone farther to actually make a little change to that section. It now just says within 50 feet, because that's actually what the wetland ordinance passed back in November 2012 actually says.
NWI being
National Wetlands
Inventory.
maps published by Fish and
National Wetlands
Inventory.
Inventory.
Yes, sir.
Fish and Wildlife publishes.
All these
maps. And, yeah, they're maps for the whole country that show the presence of wetlands. And
They're
they're
generally indicative of the presence or absence of wetlands, right?
And they all what they are. They're just like
I didn't know
soil
what-
maps. They're mapped the whole country. They're good for what they are.
Still have to have a delineation if you're going to impact actual wetlands. You can't use that as any sort of regulatory usage.
And see, going on that same thing, we've got proof of water supply of other than Effingham County. So if you're on a private water system, somebody will need to know that you have the availability. That's a direct response from us being in the red zone. You know, so you can't just say, hey, I'm going to go drill a well. We know that's not true. Show that you have the capacity to do it. Another one is this phase 1 site assessment requires a landfill certification letter from the county.
Pass.
It will landfill certification.
If it's required.
Yeah.
Right.
And the reason for that is we, the county, if you have to go to EPD, we actually have to write a letter that says that the lines are not constructed on or in the vicinity of a landfill, and that may not be the exact verbiage. We have no way of doing it, it's liability on us. So we need somebody else to give us this documentation that says that is the case. But some of these things were never codified, we just want to codify. Determination of BFE is located in zone A, you know, that's,
It's in the flow.
it's in the flood ordinance, you know, so we're picking pieces out that people understand that it's there without having to search all these ordinances. You know, the Clomar fill is, you know, so Georgia DOT encroachment permit, so if you're on Georgia, you had to have it anyhow, we didn't want to point it out so everybody understands up front. And then the next sentence is if it's required, here's the stuff you'll have to do, this utility encroachment. If it's utility encroachment, there's certain things you have to give to us because we have to make that submittal as the utility owner. And then I'm gonna let Mr. Leon talk a while on the water design section.
Further, yeah. All right, and as he said, we'll drill down to as much detail as you want, or I can gloss over all this. I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on this. I could spend 10 hours on this stuff. Believe me, I spent hundreds of hours trying to put all this together. But generally speaking, your general water standards are listed on pages 15, 16, and not a whole lot of this stuff is new. We're just pointing out that, you know, EPD has minimum standards, AWODA has standards, International Fire Codes, ISO, NFPA all have codes that inflect, you know, what's going to happen with your water design. Say Drinking Water Act, the same thing. And at this point, item I, E, and F are sort of those things where you want to be really clear as to what you can and can't do in the red zone. Under section E, if you're in the Effingham County service area, you can't use city-owned water supplies. You can only use county, privately owned if they already have a permit, and individual wells if the parcels are greater than 1 acre when fire protection is not required or provided by another source. And the same thing with item F. There are places in the unincorporated counties that are in the city service area, so you would only be able to use city water supplies, private water systems, or individual wells in those areas. So it's just those kind of things pointing out what can and can't be done so that someone doesn't get the wild idea that they could do something, you know, completely different and don't understand that there are restrictions on groundwater in this general vicinity because of saltwater treatment. You know, things like item G, that's straight out of EPD's minimum standards. Item H is something that you may or may not want to spend some time on. This generally says that if you are adjacent to an existing right-of-way where, let's just say, the water line stops somewhere and you're the next piece of property over, and you may only need a 2-inch main to serve what it is that you want to serve if you're just going to put, you know, 10 houses on the side of the road somewhere. But because the county has plans to have water service over the entire area, we would want a 16-inch main that would then connect to the rest of the 16-inch mains in the rest of the area. So this would infer that this would be used at the minimum equal to existing main, and it should extend the entire length of the proposed development property. So that does require some additional expenditures by a developer over and above what may be required specifically for their development proper. But instead, because the county is running 16-inch mains down all these roads and interconnected with each other, the suggestion there would be that they would generally upsize those, like it says, generally 16 inches.
That's not the name, that's already.
No, well, that could be considered, Nick, and it's.
Where are we at?
We're on item H on 15.
Okay, somebody
This is basically
else
by the engineers. The
goes
engineers
below him.
follow.
If a fellow next door to him, he puts a 16-inch main in, all right, somebody further down the road, well, this fellow put that 16-inch line, well, these people have to come back and help him pay for what he spent on that 16-inch line?
If you're talking about like it skips a
It's
part.
easy construction.
No.
or whatever you-
No, if you got a parcel line, and they make you run a 16-inch
Yeah,
line.
the county ends here, my parcel's here, but somebody owns a piece in between it.
No, somebody builds on the other side of where you put the 16-inch line for yourself. Would they have to help you pay for the line that you put down or somebody else's use? You didn't need that.
Well, this would basically be a system improvement, right?
Well, yes, that in the old days would be considered a subsystem improvement under the impact fee ordinances. We don't have impact fees anymore. That's not really in ordinance anymore. But yes, speaking generally, that would be something that in the past would have been referred to as a system improvement. And so does the question he's asking would be, would we treat that as a system improvement and therefore have some sort of reimbursement and or payment requirements, some sort of water and sewer agreement or what have you, to deal with that as we would have under the old impact fee rules and regulations. And that's up to the board. And if
Basically,
the board wants to do
I can
that.
say one way of looking at things, I'll put it to you this way, this is how I always felt. And with this manual, you know up front. When you know up front what the cost of doing business is, that's one thing, because you know up front. If this is what's being required of you, then you can make the decision at the time you're buying the land, okay, we're gonna have to upsize the pipe and basically help with some system improvements. And we know in advance that we've gotta do that. Is it gonna be worth it to us? Can we still make money or not?
And if not,
And having it in place like this is letting everybody know up front what is required.
Right, so if you,
That's a lot more acceptable than finding out after everything's said and done.
Well, the basic premise is we know that we're serving an area, the county in this case, or an area, and it's going to require 16-inch main to service all of the developments in it. However, that one property may only need a 6-inch line capable of producing fire protection. So if they extend a 6, across their property, then the next guy, then we cannot service our whole area. We have to get a 16 through there. So
Are you
there's
having to
different-
help with the system? You are.
So-
But it still may be feasible, and that's just what you have to figure out.
and
So
that's
we can require that extension of the main that we need, or we can say, take what you need, we'll pay the difference. I mean, again, that's up to the board. That's why Steve's pointed out, is this is one of these things that could cost money to a developer, and we want to make sure the board's.
My hang up would be that you're forcing them to use the water. It's one thing if you had the option, because if the water's available, you would have to use county water. Right?
yeah, let's use the option.
You can't use county water, and you have to, I guess it's a double
If
whammy
it's
that
not
I don't.
available, if it's not available, they can't force you. If it's not available within a distance, the 1,000 distance, then they can't force you to use it. They have to do it in the system.
Yeah, are you saying when it's available or not available?
We can't.
Yes.
If it's
It
not
would just be
available,
where it's
we
available.
can't.
You're saying if
But
it's
it's,
available?
you could also, you could infer that this would mean when it's not available too, i.e., let's just say it's 5,000 feet down the road for the purposes of argument. It's 5,000 feet down the road, so therefore it's not reasonably available according to the rules and regulations, so you're not required
Our
to
laws
use
can't
it.
require them to, then
But-
they have an option.
But right, they have the option, and if they say, okay, well, I still want to connect to county water,
In a lot of jurisdictions, you can set up an aid to construction, so as permits and other developments, they're paid back their reimbursement. I don't know if that gets complicated, how you.
oh, it certainly does. It's not terribly much dissimilar from what we've been doing in the past, and it's exceedingly complicated. And I'm not saying that we can't do it. I'm just saying that the board, if that's what the board wants to do, we can basically say that we can change this ordinance to say, you were required to upsize the pipe, but the county will pay for the difference between the size pipe that you need
I
and
think
the
that's-
size pipe that the county needs. And that's if that's what the board wants to do. But you gotta-
A good example would be the church. The church comes and they've got property on the road. There is a county 16-inch water line at the corner of their property. by ordinance, they're required to tie into the county water system, right? But the church doesn't need a 16-inch water line. They need a 2-inch line or a 4-inch line, whatever.
Maybe six,
Okay?
right.
So for them to run the 16-inch line, you know that they're gonna say, well, how are we gonna pay for this? So
And depending on the
that's what
size
I'm
of the
saying.
parcel.
Then that'll be in some kind of an agreement between us and them, or the board and the church, whoever this is, to pay the difference, because it would be a county benefit.
But that's just the
And
problem.
on a case-by-case consideration, is it ever going to be worth it to the county? Will we make enough, how many years would it take us to reimburse whatever we had to pay for that 16-inch line out of their usage? It may not be worth it to have them on the
Well,
line.
that's exactly the point that I
That's
was
my
getting at,
job.
right?
So we have to make that decision to that.
Well, we got an ordinance say if it's available, you have
Your
to.
policy to allow us to do that if that's the case, because a church would be a lot different than a subdivision.
At some point, you absolutely have to be prepared to answer that question, because if you're going to say, yes, you've got to install that, or even if you're going to say you have to install it, but we'll pay the difference, we have to be prepared to pay the difference. And we have to be prepared for exactly what Ms. Jones is pointing out, that maybe this is going to be a 20-lot subdivision, let's just say, and it's going to be over a portion of property that is 1,000 feet of frontage on Blue Jay Road. And they're going to install 1,000 feet worth of 16-inch main that may cost $100,000, let's just say, just throw a number out there. Is that worth it to them, or is it going to be a point where they would say, oh, it's going to cost me $50,000, but it's going to cost $100,000 to put in the pipe that you want, so therefore the county would need to pay $50,000. Are we willing to do that?
If we were going to make a canned policy, we would have to figure out all those scenarios and try to get them addressed properly so that we weren't losing money.
The other issue that this creates is, let's just assume we say it's not worth it, then somebody down the road decides they want to develop. Now we have 20 driveways we have to come across. We have other infrastructure, we have other things that we have to get through, because that's the only way we can get there. So it does create issues down the road by not extending across the front of those properties.
And to
Very
some
much
extent, and to some extent, my thinking in the past was, there's a control in zoning. Sometimes maybe that zoning wasn't the best thing.
I have done sleeving of driveways. You know, it's very minimal. Say that church is going to build, then the county would go in and sleeve that driveway so that when that line needs to be extended later, you've got something to go through.
We don't have to cut
No,
it, just
yeah,
rub it
right.
off.
And when you say the county would, you mean the county would pay for it to
That's
have
right.
that
I
done?
mean, we've done that with Beaufort Jasper. And they'll do, you know, either, or go ahead and lay a section of pipe and just leave it
You
cast.
just have to be prepared for that eventuality and that
What kind of money
cost.
are we talking about? I mean, I don't have to
See, it
understand
depends.
how much
You
you
just
mean
did.
to a.
Just, is what he says, it just depends on whether it's 100 foot
Of course,
frontage
that's
or
what I
1,000
mean.
foot.
Yeah.
Y'all got one coming up, you might have to answer this question
Yeah.
pretty
Very
soon.
greatly.
It depends on what it is, because water is relatively cheap. If we were talking about a sewer line, that'd be a whole nother round.
Still, it would be a big difference. You could get by with a 2-inch line, you got to put in a 16-inch line. That'd be a big difference.
It could be a very large difference in cost. You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I was going to explain this to y'all later in committee reports, but I have a circumstance exactly like this regarding the development that we talked about in committee reports last time around on Blue Jay Road directly across from Emerald Plantation.
Well, I'm
Exactly the same
anybody
scenario.
that's ever had to put in a 16-inch line didn't need it for themselves. Not here, you know.
I don't disagree. If you want my personal opinion, and maybe you don't, it's the cost of doing business in Effingham County. I mean, Effingham County has millions of dollars of investment in water supply lines and sewer for that matter. And if we aren't going to make people connect, then we'll never have them as customers. You lose them as customers forever. And then if you volunteer to pay for what I would costing up size of lines, then you're in essence you're putting yourself in the situation that this gentleman was pointing. You may or may not ever make your money back in doing that. So if you wanted my opinion, I don't think it's unreasonable to request the developer to do that. If they know it up front, just like you mentioned, it's part of the cost of doing business. There are plenty of places
See, the
nationwide.
county's in the water and sewer business too, and
There's
there's a cost to the county of being in the water and sewer business as well.
Either way-
Where do you find the happy, that works?
Either way, I suggest that you make the extension across the property. I think the conversation needs to be who pays for it.
Yeah, right.
Because ultimately, no one else can ever get to it if you start blocking yourselves in, if you never extend your infrastructure. It needs to come across. Now, we can have a conversation who pays for it, whether we require the developer, whether we pay for that, whether there's a cost sharing, however that may work.
Right.
Steve,
So,
let's say that this development was 4,000 feet or whatever down the road. And let's say that developer decided, fine, we'll put this 16-inch line in. But then something happens, there's not enough usage going to that line. Then do we have another issue that we're gonna have to start flushing water out the end of that line?
We would be creating a circumstance where you're now new flushing. Let's just use the example of this particular development across the street from Emerald Plantation. We're already flushing at Emerald Plantation now. You're just relocating the flushing 3,000 feet down the road.
Moving.
That's all. You don't create new flushing by doing that.
We already have the flushing problem.
Right, we already have that
All the
problem.
less flushing we're gonna have, but.
Right, you're not creating more flushing that needs to be done. You're just relocating it on down the road. And eventually you'll get to the point where your water line, your end of your water line isn't even connected. For the example of this one, you'll eventually get, you have this happen enough times, you get to Highway 17, and then you get enough times down Highway 17, you get Marvel Elementary School, and then you complete the loop. And then there's no more requirement for that because it's all connected. And then you basically taking your flushing requirement from whatever it may be, $100,000, $100,000 a year's worth of flushing down to next to nothing.
And had we planned it to where we only allowed growth where as we made a loop go in, that has not been done, so where we are.
That's very true. I mean, the developing parties have driven where the lines have gone and where the developers go instead of the other way around. Instead of the county inferring that, hey, we need to route development here where we have a water and sewer lines or where it's very close to water and sewer lines. It's been dealt with the other way around. So there are a lot of things to think about in that particular item of H. We can spend more time on it if you guys want to, or we can move on.
One of the things in here that is recurring is something we talked about before. Page 18, alphabet I. It's in here a couple times in the section already, but the calculation of these easements,
Yes, sir.
I think we should simplify that. I mean, if we need 15 feet, we need 15 feet.
Well, it's
Water is not a problem, but when you get into sewer, that's when it's going to become an issue.
Okay, I made a few, two example calculations earlier today along those lines for sewer. For a standard 8-inch main, 12 feet deep, the calculation becomes 1.33 times 4 plus 10 equals 15.3. So in essence, you're basically at 15 feet. I mean, I think we could add something in there that says round down to the nearest foot or something to that effect. Certainly don't want to require 15.3 foot easement.
I think you could make it much simpler, just saying up to 15 foot in depth, a 15 foot easement, or something like that. You know, if we start getting in the flat lanes we're in, I can't imagine getting in 30 foot sewer. But you know, you can have it wider. In other words, have a 0 to 15 deep, that, because I think that's just going to be way too confusing for most people.
I made another calculation just for example purposes of 20 feet deep, which is about as deep as we have in any of our gravity sewers, and 12 inch diameter, which is about as large as we have in a standard gravity sewer. That actually comes out to 23.3 feet. So it's not as if it goes to 50 feet or something like that. Even a very large sewer and very deep configurations, big and as deep as we generally have, only comes out to a 23 point something foot easement. So it's not as if we're that calculation results in a large size easement. It's just, to a certain extent, a little bit of a complex calculation. But if you're having an engineer design your sewers, you know, any engineer can figure out what that easement width would come to. We can certainly round it off to the nearest foot or the nearest 5 feet or whatever.
And see, from a practicality standpoint, a 20 foot deep sewer, if you're going to excavate that sewer to repair it, it's damaged or whatever. If you're going to slope that 20 foot deep, that's a 60 foot wide trench. So the 23 foot's not going to get it. You're going to have to trench box it, which is 8 foot wide. So there's no reason to have a 24 foot wide easement to put a trench box in. What I'm saying is, I think that it's excessive, but it's not practical either. It's excessive to require it because we're going to have to trench box it to get down to that depth. And if you can slope it back 20 foot deep through, yeah, that'd be on 3-to-1 slope. That'd be 120 feet top to top.
Well, if you did it on both sides, you wouldn't do it on both sides necessarily. You may want to do it on
You
one
got to
side.
slope both sides.
We have to do it on, right. But the point, are you suggesting that for 20 foot deep gravity sewer, we would want a 120 foot easement? I mean, that's certainly not.
I'm saying a 20 foot on a deep sewer is probably realistic. A 15 foot on shallow sewer is realistic, or 25 foot on the deep. Yeah.
And I guess the thought of doing it was, is you have a trench box, but do you drop the whole trench box 20 foot, or do you trench some and shore some, and then you gotta have your side cast somewhere too. If you're 20 foot deep, 8 foot wide, it's a pretty good pile of dirt. Then you gotta have the ability to get equipment back in it. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not in the sewer excavation business, so I will defer to other people as to whether or not it can be done within a 15-foot hole, but we were trying to make sure that space.
I've just shown that to a couple people, and they're like,
It
to be
takes
honest,
sense.
I've actually had guys that I had to help them figure out how to do the math on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be a little too complicated. I think we'd be better with some brackets.
Okay, we can do that.
It's not unreasonable. And would you say the same thing for, mostly just for regular sewer, obviously, right? Because
The water.
99 times out of 100, you're not gonna have an issue with water because it's only 3 foot deep, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's your sewer that's the big.
All right. Okay.
Is that same calculation in storm?
Yeah.
Yes.
But maybe the engineers that are calculating, determining that, right, not the people in the field.
You know, when we're talking about, the reason to have that easement is so if you have to get back to it.
Yeah.
And, you know,
But the necessary width, the engineers will be determining that in the design.
but if you went by that, you would have you know, a varying easement between these houses.
It may
and
go
these other
that,
houses.
technically
Yeah.
it could.
That's what I'm saying. Anyway, I think we could simplify that.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, and I don't want to skip too far ahead, but since you brought it up, page 36, drainage, and these are done a little bit different for, they are in harm. If you look at B, little b on page 36, these are for open channels. See, these are for ditches 1.5 feet wide, the easement should be 20 foot plus the top width. So that's where we, for an open channel, it's the width of it plus enough room for a piece of equipment on the side. But then on C, you get back in that convoluted calculation you were talking about for closed drainage systems. So if you're okay with B, which is more intuitive common sense, we can just alter C for a table.
We
You know
could
what
do
I'm saying?
something like B for C under storm and also for that previous part under sanitary sewer as well.
If it's an open ditch, it'll have to be maintained.
And it's got to be the width of the open ditch plus enough room to maintain it. So I mean, that's fairly common sense. Yeah. So we'll alter C based on that conversation. I'm running out of time. Like page 19 is just a checklist. It's everything we've talked about in checklist form, so that whoever designed the plans can do a check off. We can use them for reviewing the plans. We can do a check off. Now, starting on page 20, this is actually the calculation that ISO uses for needed fire flow. This is just putting it in a form that we use, so there's no difference of opinion as to how it works. The calculation is very straightforward. It comes completely straight out of ISO with the addition of new under RPZ, which probably is off now too, because that backflow preventer has been passed now.
That's correct.
The ordinance has been passed. So again, it's just another form it is the ISO calculation. But it just gives all the pieces, makes it a little simpler. And then number 2, available fire flow, straight out of ISO. It's just putting a form that we've never had together so that we can do it. So it just makes it simpler for somebody to design, us to review. We're all talking the same thing. And then the other new is this owner compliant declaration. It deals with fire lines. And it's just, it's acknowledgement that the owner is responsible for maintaining that fire line system.
And the detector, check it out. I mean, check it back.
It's just some of those upfront documents, everybody knows where you stand. It's where it is now, the private lines would change nothing. It's just this owner-client declaration is a new form that we will be asking people to sign, acknowledging that ownership responsibility. And then when you get into page 25, sanitary sewer, you'll see it basically follows the exact same format as water, just now particular to sewer, and item C is the one that Mr. Mason had wanted to change to a table. We'll get that changed. Other than that, it follows the exact same format. Let's see, B years. Page 26B, you got another new. This is basically providing wastewater load information, including equivalent residential units. There's a chart in here now for calculating ERUs. That has no bearing on the fee. It's just so for us, a way to manage our inventory, know plan-wise what we expect to come in our plants. That's the
And
whole
to our lift
purpose.
stations.
In our lift stations, right. That's the whole purpose of that. It's so that we get them to calculate demands based on the ERU, that we understand what it is for planning purposes.
And there would be no particular ramifications of that other than, for example, if you were to fill out the checklist and determine that you needed 500 gallons a minute, and that was not available in the pump station, then it would become an issue where then it has to be determined whether or not the lift station needs to be upgraded, if that was the case, in order to handle this additional development. So that's where that goes in the long-term thought process.
Page 27, another checklist, just like the other one. Page 28, you'll see the actual formula I was referring to for the calculation of the ERUs, and it just works on the left. There's a particular use, a multiplication factor in the middle, translates out into GPD divided by 300, you got the ERUs. So Section 5.5 actually gets into reuse. You'll see a whole lot of new in here, and that's because we really never had reuse standards. And this is, again, putting back on the developer, design engineer hat. This is an extremely helpful situation for me because we've always required calculations for usage within a subdivision to size your reuse lines, but there was really no criteria for what they were calculated on. So I might decide I want 2 of my yards irrigated and I need a Dixie straw, strung between the 2 to get them done. This actually sets forth some requirements for the reuse infrastructure and actual sizing calculations for those lines. And you'll see that picking up on page 32, where your design standards pick up. It actually begins to tell you how to calculate for sizing purposes those lines. And then again, we can, I'm trying to see what's minimum size of 4 inch, minimum service size of 1 inch. Again, since there was no requirements, I may have a 2 inch reuse line, and functionally it just doesn't work when everybody starts trying to water and irrigate their particular lawns. You just don't get enough flow pressure to do that. So, and then like G, pipes are sized and maintained pressure 45 during peak conditions. So it just starts setting out some of the, and there's that right away work again. We need to change it, okay?
Yep.
Where did the ERU calculation? It says exhibit 2, but that looks like fire protection.
It's page 28.
Is that what you're referring to?
Where are you reading this?
Okay, so it's exhibit 5, not 2. Okay.
Where were you reading that?
B on 26.
B on 26.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So it should be exhibit 5, not exhibit 2. I changed that.
And with that, we're pretty much going to bump up into stormwater requirements, which we have not finished from here on forward. So are there any specific questions, water sewer reuse at this point? Formatting, anything you see you don't like, you want change, you want to go into more detail?
Does it address the deeding of property to the county?
That'll be later on.
Yes.
Yes, later on.
I kind of hit on it, but I didn't.
Yes. There's a whole section on it back in the
Do we
back.
think we kind of address that well, or maybe that's?
No, well, let me back up. From this point forward, from page 34 to the end, this isn't finished.
Okay.
There's still some work that needs to be done. I'm not saying it's completely unfinished, but it's not finished as much as the front pages are. We beat that down, we're pretty happy about it. The front pages. From here on, there's some definite things that we need to look into. We were doing the manual meeting, and we're doing it from start to finish, and this is where we got to it. It broke up, we never got back, and it's stuff that requires my input more so that I have not input into yet. Y'all heard that before.
But to answer your question, yes, page 52, section 7.1.2 does very go into detail about the deeds.
Yeah.
And your requirements. I actually
I saw that, but I haven't really.
Right. Right, and it's by not necessarily complete, but it certainly gets into that, and that's where any additional items would go. I actually did add something to that just this morning.
Well, this is the opportunity to do that.
Right,
Yes,
exactly.
yes, yes, correct.
Exactly.
It's all spelled out.
Yes,
And going forward, a couple of basic questions I would like to poll the audience as we're here, if we don't have any more water, sewer, stormwater, or reuse water questions. And you'll notice on page 35, we're getting review submittal requirements following of the local design manual, project narrative, site fingerprint, existing conditions proposed, post-construction stormwater management system narrative, existing post-construction stormwater management system plan, downstream analysis planning, landscape plan. This is written not to comply with our local ordinance today. This is written to comply with the coastal stormwater supplement. We wrote this manual in compliance with the coastal stormwater supplement, not necessarily the Georgia stormwater management manual. This is a question for the board. That is not required today. Today, our stormwater requirements for the Georgia stormwater management manual, the coastal stormwater supplement came out previous to our stormwater revision, our ordinance being put into place. All of Chatham County is now on it. They are required to do it for their phase 2 permit.
Phase 2
MPDS permit.
Yes.
We will be there at some point.
Very soon.
So it's coming to us at some point. We're not required today, we will be. Again, I'm gonna put on that old hat of a design engineer, and I'll take up for the developer on this. I like the coastal stormwater supplement. I like it for a lot of reasons. It uses the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual, and it builds on that. What it does is it looks at post-construction stormwater a little more closely. It looks at more returning stormwater, naturally infiltrating it into the ground rather than runoff. What it does in a nutshell is it saves you money. It takes a runoff reduction volume that's generated by the Georgia Stormwater Management Manual that you have to detain on site and release, extended release over a 24-hour period, and it looks at how you infiltrate it into the ground. And if you can do that with disconnections, swales, ditches, stormwater gardens, green roofs if you want them, a number of different ways, that runoff reduction volume goes to zero. You don't have to account for it in your ponds. So it takes that dead storage, it takes the additional size of the pond that you had to oversize them for that particular volume out, and it does a lot of things good for the environment. I'm a real green guy here. It returns water back into your natural groundwater recharge areas. It helps with the heat parts of stormwater that goes into and Steve can tell you more about water chemistry, how it starts, once it heats, things bloom, they die, they deplete oxygen. It really is, bad for stormwater, and it helps constituents. And the best filtering you're going to get is when it never enters the receiving water bodies. And it also introduces a litany of different better site construction techniques that we can start reducing parking lots, we can reduce footprints of buildings, different things we can do. Now, there's two parts of this. One, I'm trying to do a sales pitch because I like it, and I think the board, I would hope that y'all would adopt this and move forward, because it is not, in my opinion, a detriment to a developer, an engineer, anyone. It is a help. It's an assistance tool. It was written specifically for the coastal areas for this reason. However, if we adopt that, there are a number of green better site practices and green techniques that are in direct contradiction to our zoning ordinances. So if we're going to do it and fully implement it in a future meeting, we'll need to come back and take a look at our zoning ordinance.
Right, let's just a really quick example. Length of driveways. One of the things that it suggests is you can reduce the amount of stormwater generated if you would reduce the amount of impervious surface associated with driveways. But driveway length is driven by setbacks. And so if you reduce the setback from the front street to the house, it will be a shorter driveway and less impervious surface, and therefore less stormwater generated. That's a good thing, but at the same time, it is against the current zoning ordinance, because the current zoning ordinance requires a certain setback. So the question then would become, we're willing to change the zoning ordinances to reduce setbacks if you're doing that for the purposes of trying to reduce your stormwater generation, which is good for the whole stormwater system. So that's just an example.
Curb and gutter is another one. They want to go away from curb and gutter back to roadside ditches because it begins to infiltrate water, sediments, and reduces all those pollutant loads and so forth. That's something. Parking is another one. Most times our parking requirements are done for peak times. And if you drive by any parking lot, the majority of the time it's half full or less. So reducing the pervious area of that providing the resident I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Reducing the impervious area, providing the resident pervious structure. It could be grass bank. There's still a structure under it, but it's in grass. So it doesn't rut or dip, but there's different ways of doing it. It's changing a mindset. And if the board is opposed to that, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if you're opposed to it, it's going to be harder to fully implement the coastal stormwater supplement. It can still be done with our current regulations. And quite frankly, we have allowed people to use it.
I think I'm familiar, you could reduce a lot of cost in stormwater piping.
Correct.
And such. Is that what, I know at Pooler they're requiring, it may be like a parking island, 20 by 20 island that's swaled that
Right.
actually is collecting water rather than a landscape island that's actually.
That came out of the coastal stormwater
Okay.
supplement. All of Chatham County, depending on incorporated or unincorporated, is on it because of the phase 2 NPDS permit. They were all required to do it by date end of last.
I've heard good things about it from you.
It really works well. Those are called stormwater creative wetlands or stormwater planners, or they're different.
It's really a win-win for everybody. I mean, you're exactly right. It reduces the cost of stormwater infrastructure, and it's better for the environment and everything.
There's a new Harley Davidson store will be built in 204-95. And with this new manual, using the design specs, it's about 2 acres that they're going to build on, and there won't be any open retention using this new style.
You can certainly do it.
The old rules were set up to get all of the stormwater into a pond, collect it all, and get it into the pond. This is all,
That's a good thing.
generated to begin with.
You risk, when you get one contaminant, you can contaminate all your stormwater, right?
Well, the other problem too, and I don't want to make this a stormwater discussion, run out of time, but if y'all want to drill down into this later, is the old way of doing it was you control like the 25 and the 50-year storm. Well, the 25 pure storm, we don't get very many of them. 85% of the storms that happen are attenuated under the old regulations. We fixed that in our supplement now because we do the one for extended detention to 2510. But however, we miss a lot of those storms, and it really does work a whole lot better. You use your overbank flood protection for extreme conditions, you attenuate the rest in the pond, and it works out really well.
Back to your original point, I think what we want to do is get the feeling of the board that we need to keep going forward with this particular section based on the expectation that the board will be happy with moving forward with coastal stormwater supplement in the near future. This can all be done together, or would you like us to throw that in the toilet and not do it until we're required to do it by ED, which will happen in the next few years?
What you're saying is there's going to be a point, there's going to be a conflict in the two. And to me, I believe we're better off going with coastal supplements.
Which is common around here, most people have done it. And for the record, yes, I was adamantly opposed to the coastal supplement when it came out. I had been won over by the Greens. So, I mean, it really is, I'm that aggravating engineer, but it really is a good document, I believe. And we'll be glad to drill down into the details if y'all like. It's only 2 books about this thick that go 2 more about that thick, so
It's good stuff.
we'll have it done in 3.4
I can tell
years.
you it goes against everything else ever talked about building a parking lot.
Yeah.
Typically, you try to collect the water, put it in a pipe, and send it off site.
And get it away.
That's exactly opposite of what it is now.
Well, is there any commissioner that would not want to proceed in that manner under the new guideline?
I think I would, but I'd like
I gotta
to
study
read a
it
little
more, I gotta
bit
understand it more.
from everything I've heard.
Do y'all want to do that in a workshop setting? You want me to provide you with 642 pages, and I made that number up, but it's probably close, of documentation? How
I
would
didn't
you
know
like
if
to?
you provided 642 pages of documentation, but
It's
a recap and a work session and a workshop might be good.
Pick up on
Just on that subject.
Okay.
Surely they've got some kind of spiel on it.
Yeah, I've been to them, I'm probably, NPC's done, I'm sure we can get them NPC on their
We
spiel.
could either have somebody from Busy come, or yes, we could use their documents and
If
just
I
present it.
probably do that, yeah. They've got a whole natural resource protection division.
Jackie T will come in and choose.
Because it's my understanding, you need to know what direction to do.
Yes, for this
so that
particular
you don't
section
have-
of the manual, right, we really can't complete it unless you guys are comfortable with moving forward with the CSS. Or we can ditch it and just go back to the old, just like Steve was saying, just send it all out and send it into a bond and get rid of it mindset. But at some point in the near future, we're going to be required to implement the CSS. So in my opinion, we need to go ahead and do it now. Let's go ahead and fight with it and get it done as part of this, instead of just putting it off for a short period of time. But by all means, if you need us to send you, I mean, there's a link, it's all available online. So it's not as if we need to send you
We'll send you,
650 pages of paper, we can just send you a link.
In
to
the
look
end,
at.
it's better water quality for the county, and it's
more cost effective.
It's more cost effective.
Development.
It really is a more cost-effective way of developing, it really is.
Would it be more productive for you commissioners, for them, for maybe Steve or Toss to come up with a list of things that we might have to change in our present ordinances in order to adopt that?
Yeah, that's what we need the highlights of how it would affect.
Can you do that?
We can now, we don't have to change our ordinances to adopt it. We can adopt it, you just can't do everything that's in it.
I understand, but I think to go forward, in order to make a decision how to move now, we need to know what it could bring up down the road.
Yeah, oh, and I understand what you're saying, but again, we can use that manual currently under our existing ordinances with absolutely no changes. It's just, of the 10 tools they give you, you may only use 2 of them.
For example, building shorter driveways wouldn't be an option under there. You would be able to reduce your impervious surface by reducing driveway size because we require a minimum driveway length based on the fact that there's a building setback. So,
And speaking from a developer who actually did that and reduced to 25-foot setbacks, in Stonegate subdivision, I can tell you it creates problems. I would not be interested in doing that again. With parking, when people park in their driveways in the back of the car because people want to park too deep, then they park across the sidewalks and out into, it's not long enough.
Well, you can reduce the driveway length. The other thing it allows you to do is take, instead of a 12 or 14-foot license of concrete, do 2 wheel paths.
That's,
So
there's
you
other
could
ways to
you
do
could
it.
do it the other way. And again, that was just an example that came up. I mean, there's certainly others.
But I think that's something the commissioners would, I know I would like to know all of the things that we might have to consider in order to implement all of these 10 items or whatever, however many there are.
It makes a huge difference on commercial sites.
it would be more impervious.
But I think some of the things that you'll see would be possible setbacks, paving materials, and plantings is what would probably be some of the biggest things.
One subdivisions is more roadside ditches, and there's issues with those too. You know, it's a balancing act.
But see, that's the issue, like the setback. If somebody wanted to come in right now and do a development and cite that and say, I want to implement these items, but to do that, I need 25-foot setbacks rather than, by our present ordinances, the only way to do that is under a PUD. And you can't do that under a normal residential development, correct?
I think we can. There's just a minimum acreage. Is that for
The setbacks are based on the zoning district.
How do you regulate like a pervious paving material over time it fills in and it's becomes.
It has to be maintained.
And who's gonna, you know?
That would be, right,
Well,
there are requirements in there for developers to sign documents that basically say they're going to maintain their stormwater features, whatever they may be.
And let me say the best way to answer that is I don't know, but City of Savannah's been doing it for years. I mean, it's a good question to go ask them. Are you having issues? Does it work? You know, what are the problems that you're having? So I did some of those in 2014, years ago, pervious parking lot. So I know they've been doing it for years, and they went through some problems, and there's certain materials and velocities and stuff that you have to do. There's pervious concrete, there's pavers, there's a litany of different products. So some probably don't work, but I mean, given the history, they're probably good with that. Mr. Chairman,
See, a simpler way to do it may be for us to adopt in our ordinances that only 60% of the area of the lot can be covered with impervious material. That's how most other municipalities and jurisdictions have done it, I think, by setting a percentage. That means then the developer has to decide what size houses are going to be built, which then dictates the size of lots, which, you know, it all falls back down.
It's one way.
But anyway, anything else? Charlotte. All right, we adjourn the workshop. We'll reconvene at 5:15.